Hey guys, what's going on? I'm going to take you guys through a bunch of different ways to perform a single leg deadlift today. So single leg deadlifts is one of my favorite lower body exercises, especially if you're somebody who's trying to train your glutes and hamstrings and trying to minimize load on the back. If you're someone who's worked your way up to, a fairly heavy deadlift or Romanian deadlift, one of the things that might be limiting you loading your glutes and hamstrings could be just what your lower back can handle. The benefit to doing stuff single-legged is that you get both sides of the lower back to support a weight, but you're only functioning on one leg. So the load you're going to put on yourself is just not going to be definitely nearly as heavy as what you would do if we're going two legs at the same time. So I'm going to walk you guys kind of through a progression sequence, sort of going from someone who's never done this before into a couple of different progressions on the basic Romanian deadlift. So what I'm basically looking for is, if I've got one leg that's going to stay off the ground, I want to treat it like I've got a rod from the top of my head down to the bottom of this heel. So all this needs to move together. The goal is we're hinging off the hip, but we need to make sure that there's not any extra movement. So when I hinge, again, all this stays glued. I don't want to do things like drive this leg up where I'm creating this low back extension or this movement that's just not coming away from the hip. So the left leg over here is the one performing the load. The right leg stays, again, roughly in line with the rest of my torso as I pull myself up. Now there's a bunch of ways to do the loading on this. You can put your foot down between reps. You can choose to keep it up between reps. It depends on if you want to trade tension on that one side versus the load you're going to use, or if you want to focus more on balance or focus more on weight. But if you're someone who has a really hard time keeping this straight line from your top of your head to your heel, what you can actually do, if you take a foam roller, just like a full-size foam roller, we can use this to kind of glue everything together. I'm going to put the foam roller on the top of my shoelaces like this, and I'm going to press down with this top hand. The idea is that as I'm pushing down, I'm going to almost use this hand to initiate the movement. So I can kind of guide everything back. So it's keeping everything really connected. And as long as you keep pressure, both resistance at the foot and that pressure at the hand, it'll stay together. Now if you get lazy with it and you let the foam roller fall out, that's not going to help. But if you keep this really locked in, then it can be a good way if you're someone who struggles with feeling like you're always getting your lower back. One of the issues you're probably having is you're not doing a great job of controlling from the abdominal wall. You're probably thinking too much about extending at your spine. This downward pressure creates that bracing sensation for you, and then you can just work your reps from there. And again, you could choose to keep the foot up in the air if you want a little bit more balance work, or you can plant your foot between reps. Personal preference, if your goal is just muscle building, I would lightly touch the foot down between reps. I care way less about balance than about creating tension on the side that we are working on. So if you've never done it before, that's how I would start. Now, if you're getting to the point where you're going to start adding a load, you could do 2 dumbbells or a barbell. To be perfectly honest with you, I kind of hate putting a load in both sides. My preference is to have one side or the other be loaded. So if we're going to add weight, the way that I would recommend starting is I would put the weight on the side opposite the leg that we're using. So my left leg is going to stay down on the ground. My right hand is going to take the weight. This is called a contralateral loading. So it's the opposite side. So as I'm driving into the same idea, I'm keeping everything stiff. What's happening is the weight being on my right while I'm using my left side is stopping my hip from turning up toward the ceiling. Okay, which is going to cause me to use a lot of my back. So the weight is actually helping correct that dysfunction. So as I come down, I can use that. Hip goes back, and then hip pulls forward. So again, this is called a contralateral loading. So especially if you are someone who's really trying to correct an excess of hip rotation, I would start there. Now, once you start to build this weight up, so that was a 35-pound dumbbell. Let's say I get to the point where I'm using maybe like a 70 or 75 pound dumbbell, and the weight over here is no longer helping keep me squared. It's actually starting to pull me the wrong way, which can absolutely happen if you're someone who's ever tried doing a 75 or 80 pound dumbbell, especially not holding on to anything for balance. The weight can start to move you around a little bit. So then what I would do is I would start moving it on the side that you're using. Okay, so we're gonna flip it. So it's called an ipsilateral loading position, which is same side. So now, especially with some of those heavier weights, that's gonna let me still put that load on my glutes and hamstrings, but not constantly feel like I'm getting pulled off to the one side. Now the challenge is that if you put that weight on this side, it could favor letting your hip twist. So you do need to be someone who hopefully at this point has gotten a good amount of control over your hips. If you struggle with balance kind of across the board, there's nothing wrong with getting a bench up at hip or chest height and just using this. If you're using it for stability, that's okay. Now what I don't want is I don't want to put a guy really tight to this bench and have him come down and basically push himself up with this arm, because that's not going to do anything for my lower body. But if you stay a little bit more away from it and it's just functioning for a little bit of stability, if your goal is just muscle building, I would be willing to sacrifice that stability for the extra weight. If your goal is to build stability, then don't use it. So those are kind of the loading patterns that I would use to start. Now there are two other ways that we could change what's going on. So the first would be to move to what's called a kickstand or a B stance position. And again, you can load this with either of the versions that I showed you in the beginning, so same side or opposite side. What you would basically do is you start with your feet next to each other. Just take a step forward, and this just puts you like you're in mid-stride. Okay, so think if I'm just about to walk across the room, I just stop myself in the middle of that first step. I've put myself into this kickstand or B stance position. The whole idea is the leg stays on the floor, but it's not in a position where it can do much besides lend me a little bit of balance. So now from here, again, I can just drive my hip into it. Because that right leg is staying on the floor, I'm not getting challenged as hard on the balance, so I could push the loading a little bit more this way. Now what I don't want to do is I don't want to sit all of my weight back into this leg, because now it's not just being a kickstand, now it's doing too much of the work. So again, if I'm here, start together, step forward, this is my position, I stay here, I want to go hip up and back, this leg is doing all the work, this leg is basically just loitering, and then I pull my hip forward. Again, I could put it on this side, or I could load this side. So the last option that I like to use is to make the top position really, really hard by not allowing the glutes to rest. So if you're standing all the way up at the top position, gravity runs straight down, there's really no work being done by your butt and hamstrings at the top here. All the work is happening down here. Now, if you want to ramp up the challenge level, you can elevate the back foot up on a bench. So very similar to like a Bulgarian split squat. If you're trying to get your spacing right, what you can do is just take a seat, put a leg out, and then just use that to set your distance. Put a foot up, and I can load this however I want to, left hand, right hand. But now, if I visualize what I talked about earlier, I want to keep my back leg and the top of my head glued into this rod-like position. As I'm going into my deadlift, I want to stop when I'm basically even with this back leg. Now, this left glute over here is doing a ton of work because it never gets to rest. I don't want to stand all the way up. Two reasons. One, I'm letting the glute rest, and two, because my foot is elevated, I've got a little bit more room to overextend my lower back. So if I switch legs, you can kind of see what it looks from this side. Same idea, I want to go hip back. Again, I'm not shifting anything into that bench. I just go hip back. And then as I pull up, You can see I'm nowhere near fully extended at this hip. So this is really loading that bottom position away from the top of hip extension. So ton of different options. The single leg deadlift is a great exercise. Give some of these a shot. If you've got questions, make sure you throw them in the comments. I'm happy to answer questions if you have them. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to our channel, and I'll see you guys next time.